Here's a router. This is a router. And that's a router. Which is better or best, and thus right for you? Let's take a look. Now, what I'm not going to do is I'm not going to stand here and bore you with the spec sheets for all these machines, but what I will do is give you my thoughts and experiences while using them. So when do I use this router versus that router? It depends on what I'm doing and how long I'm doing it for. I also take into consideration the type of material I'm working with and how big that piece is. I know that may sound complicated, but it's not really. I use the router table for pieces that are too small or too thin to safely and reliably use a handheld router. I use the trim router for routing along edges. I also use this type for dados, and if I'm 1, using soft wood, 2, I don't have to go too deep, and 3, I only have a few dados to do. Other than that, the plunge router gets most of the heavy duty work. Trim routers are lighter and easier to handle as you can use them with one hand, but there is a trade-off. They have less powerful motors, and that one-handed thing can turn and bite you if it slips out of your hand for whatever reason. Trim routers are a nice accessory to have if you can afford an extra tool, but I wouldn't recommend them if you don't already have a router in your shop. This particular one that I have has the ability to control the rotation speed of the bit. That comes in handy if you really want to have the most control possible to prevent burning your workpiece, as well as extending the life of your router bits. Excessive heat buildup isn't good for your workpieces, and it's not good for your bit either, because excessive heat buildup will dull that thing in short order. In fact, the more heat, the duller the bit gets. The duller the bit, the more heat. Catch 22, anybody? Now, there are other factors to consider regarding keeping your bits in tip-top shape, but that's not what this video is about. It's about routers, and being able to control the rotation speed is a valuable asset in trim routers or their larger counterparts, such as the plunge router. If you head to my website, simplyeasydiy.com, I'll have a chart listing bit diameters along with their speed recommendations. Speaking of plunge routers, obviously these are going to have more power behind them, and that's good for the most part. However, I consider that extra pop to be a little unnecessary if all I'm doing is rounding over the edges of a project. That said, these things offer some notable benefits over their smaller trim router counterparts. First, the larger base plates make it easier to stabilize the router when you're first starting a cut, ending one, or traveling along the edge of a workpiece. Second, safety. 2 hands will do that for you. Plus, if you've ever seen one of those trim routers pop out of someone's hand and bounce around like popcorn, taking chunks out of different body parts as they do, that'll make you even more appreciative of the 2-hand feature. Third, these things are like workhorses. If you have a bit to stick in it, the 2¼ horsepower motor will spin that thing in whatever material you need, Bossa Nova style. That's right, I said Bossa Nova. Router tables have their own benefits. For one, a router fence, along with an ability to duplicate cuts in multiple pieces. So if you want to do template or pattern work, router tables are extremely helpful for that. You can also use it as a jointer by shimming the outfeed side of the router fence. And this small piece here, I would never attempt to use a handheld router on. It's the router table all the way on something like that. So which is best? Which one should you get if you're on a budget and you want the most bang for your buck? The answer to that question isn't as simple as merely comparing the 3 spec sheets. You have to be able to answer a few questions, such as, what are you most likely to use one for? And that answer isn't as simple if you're new to woodworking and DIY projects. That's why I don't necessarily recommend woodworking routers as one of the first tools to purchase for your shop. Do some projects first. Figure out what things you are more inclined to build as opposed to what you're not. If what you're drawn to do are a bunch of outdoor projects like chicken coops and rabbit hutches, well, I have several videos on my channel that depict how I do that, and I never touched a router. However, if you're building indoor furniture, I'd recommend the plunge router, as they can easily handle stop dados and you're not necessarily dealing with a bunch of small workpieces. I'm not going to go over all the router lingo and terms. This is the doohickey thing, the thingamabobbers here, and that is the flippy jig. The one thing that I will call by its name is right here. That is called the collet or collet nut. These come in 2 sizes generally, 1/4 inch and 1/2 inch. Why? Because router bits will either have a 1/4 inch or a 1/2 inch diameter shank. Which one is better? Yeah, I really hate that question because, again, it depends. Each has their pros and cons, but I can tell you that the 1/4 inch is more common. In fact, I'm not even sure my local hardware store carries 1/2 inch shank bits. I'd probably have to go to a specialty store or shop online for that size. All of my routers in my shop are a 1/4 inch. I'll go into some of the pros and cons of both sizes on my website, simplyeasydiy.com. Check the description for the link. Now, all of my routers have this press and hold lock to loosen and tighten the collet nut. Just rotate the collet till it locks in place. Then I can use the wrench that usually comes with the router to loosen or tighten the collet around the shank of the bit. One thing to keep in mind when inserting bits into your router is not to shove them all the way in and then tighten them down. Leave about 1/8 of an inch space between the bottom of the bit and the collet. If you press it all the way down, you could get some extra chatter as you're routing. And you're going to want to make sure that you're tightening that well. I've had bits come loose and that pretty much sucks. If you look down at the base plate from over the top, you will see a little arrow imprinted on the base plate. That indicates the rotation of the bit. I always make sure that the backside rotation of the bit is feeding into the material. If I'm using a straight edge, I want the backside rotation feeding into that straight edge. That's pretty standard right there. However, if I come at this setup from the other side, the backside rotation is going away from the straight edge, and that is going to want to pull my router out and away. Now, a lot of times that can happen rather suddenly, and it's oftentimes a major contributor to one of these trim routers flying out of people's hands. Now, if I have a setup like this and I want to route the inside of a workpiece, I'm going clockwise to keep the backside rotation going into the material. If I'm routing the outside, I'll go counterclockwise. Again, being mindful of that backside rotation. If I'm doing this on a router table, I'm going to mirror those directions. Now, with all that, there are situations where I go against everything that I just said and route with the rotation of the bit instead of against it. That is a technique called climb cutting, and I use that a lot in order to prevent blowout. In fact, I just used it on a project I did just a couple of weeks ago called the Simple, Easy, and Elegant Bookcase. However, I ended up doing some fancy editing to that video, so you don't actually see me doing it. You see me routing the dado, but you don't see me finishing it. If you'd like more information on the climb cutting technique, you can visit my website at simplyeasydiy.com.